and fact-filled class today because, you know, there are so many different scholarly views regarding the Apiru. Now, the Apiru are attested long before Israel became a nation. They are attested as early as about 1800, 2000 BCE. They are in Mesopotamia, and then later on they're in Egypt. So you kind of see this migration of Apiru. They surprisingly originate somewhere around Ur, and they become very migratory as Ur falls. So this kind of indicates a common place of origin. What we're going to look at today are going to be the specifics. And we're going to look at quite a few things before we actually jump into the Apiru to make sure that we have a solid foundation as we get into the information. So I do have a video slideshow, so we're going to go to the slideshow. All right, let me share this. All right, this should come up in just a minute. As soon as I see that it's there, we will proceed forward. So what we're going to start off with are going to be some contemporary ideas with the nation. So the first thing that I wanted to catch us up on is going to be where we are and where the Apiru fall. So in the previous classes, what we have seen is this progression of history with Israel having exodus to Egypt, and now they're in the land of Canaan. Now, so far we've had Hatshepsut, Thutmose II. I'm sorry, this should be Thutmose III. That is wrong on my chart. This should be Thutmose III. And then Hotep II and Thutmose IV. So with this coincides with the time Joshua was prior to this. There was the captivity of Mesopotamia that was prior to this. So most of this falls within the foray of Othniel and this period of captivity. You will notice that my dates do not match exactly. There is some discrepancy with of about 20 years between the biblical chronology and the Egyptian chronology. One of the issues that arises in Egyptology is that Hatshepsut and some of the Egyptian writers give her husband a much longer reign than what scholars do modernly. So it is very possible that Hatshepsut is actually correct with the duration of her father's reign. And if that is correct, then it would actually explain, and then it would coincide with the biblical chronology as we have it today. So this is just kind of catch you up to speed with where we are in biblical history. Thutmose III, again, it is misidentified in my slideshow, but Thutmose III actually has invaded Israel for about 18 years. He's invaded the entire land of Canaan. He's had various campaigns. And shortly thereafter, we find that there is this period of captivity where Israel is subjected and brought into subjection by the Canaanites. Because why? Because they did not drive them out of the land. So at this point in time, there is a captivity to Moab that coincides with the Egyptians campaigning in Canaan and probably leveraging Moab as some sort of vassal entity, collecting Pharaoh's tribute throughout the territory. One of the things that scholars look at when you look at who is on that land and who the people are, they look at burial customs, they look at pottery, ways of living. A lot of different practices reveal contemporarity. So in other words, you know, we're not going to be playing Pokemon Go 20 years ago. Some of it actually we won't even be playing it last month. So this whole idea of, you know, things that are similar, you know, I doubt we'll even be playing Pokemon Go 10 years from now. It's kind of a fad that's going on right now. The same kind of thing occurs anciently, although the progression is much slower. What you find in ancient Egyptian literature, as well as in scripture literature of this era, and this really occurs from about the time of Thutmose through the end of about the 19th dynasty. This would have been the time of Ramses, where when you write of your victories. You write it with extreme hyperbole. You're just going to overinflate and overinstate this. Minerva does this with the Israelites still, where he says that he laid waste and their seed is not, when he came up and he confronted Israel. We know that that is not actually accurate. We know that Israel did indeed survive. So Minerva still is an overstatement. But we find the same literary type of scribalship, the same literary expression in Joshua. So we're going to actually work from the bottom up with this, because the book of Joshua and the events recorded in Joshua did occur a good 30 to 50 years before Tutmosis had invaded Canaan. So look at what Joshua says. He says, and they went out, and this is, let me give you a little preface here. This is referring to Joshua and Israel warring in Canaan at the initial conquest. So this is an earlier period in time. So, and Joshua went out, and they and all their hosts with them, much people, even as the sand that is on the seashore in multitude, with horses and chariots very many. And when all these kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Well, here we have something that is, you know, an exaggeration. You know, they were with the waters of the seashore in multitude. This just is an expression that shows this incredibly vast army that the Canaanites had. They were a lot of people, and they had a mighty force. But Tutmosis uses very similar, and this is Tutmosis III, and this is what he writes. He, referring to Ra, entrusted to me the foreign countries of retinue. Retinue is an Egyptian term for Canaan. Being millions and hundreds thousands of men, individuals of every foreign country waiting in their chariots. 330 princes, every one of them having his own army came. So again, we see this hyperbole of this idea of 1 million and hundreds of thousands of men, which is equivalent to this idea of the sand that is on the seashore in multitude. So again, this kind of, what this demonstrates, they're by no means are they referring to the same event. Now, they are referring to Canaan's capabilities from roughly 1490 all the way to probably about 1420 BCE. We find that Canaan actually had very large population with a very large standing army. So that shows contemporaneity, as well as the use of the literary prose. This second thing that we find is similar during this era, is the protocol for war that is very similar to both Israel and Egypt. Both were friendly to cities that submitted to them. And let me just preface, for Israel, this did not apply to any of the cities that God had commanded Israel to cast them out and to inhabit those cities. This really applied more to the foray, those on the northern borders where Israel did not have the population to be able to subjugate, control, and populate those cities. So they both did offered treaties. They offered a vassal status to those cities that opened up to them. The second thing, both sought to depopulate Canaan. God had commanded Israel to drive the Canaanites out of the land so that they could secure a homeland. If you look at Numbers 33, 50 through 54, you find very specific instructions for cleansing the land of Canaan so that it was a safe homeland for Israel. You know, you have people in the same land who have different political agendas, who have different ideas of morals and values and worshiping of God. It often brings people into conflict. God saw this, and this is why he desired to give Israel a homeland. Now, when Tutmosis invaded Canaan, he did something very similar. He deported many many Canaanites, but we also find from his inscriptions, as we saw last week, that he deported over 10,000 Apiru at this time. So the Apiru were well into Canaan, and it appears that Tutmosis' campaigns specifically targeted the Apiru. And what is fascinating, the places where he campaigned, and the places where he attacked the Apiru are specifically places that we know from Joshua and Judges where Israel had already settled. You know, the Judean highlands going onto the ancient Amorite territory. It was those areas that Thutmose had that he had targeted during his campaign. So this would have displayed a rebellious and a group of Israelites who were not obeying the commandments as God had given to them. So they were brought back to Egypt in ships because, as we saw last time, when Thutmose deported many of the people from Canaan, rather than marching them over the land, ironically, he did deport them using ships and taking them back to Egypt, where they were not sold into slavery. No man bought them, as a matter of fact. They entered the corvée and they became wards of the state, where they worked for Pharaoh, worked on his building projects. So what this meant was there really was no person by which they could buy their freedom. They had to work for the state in his work boroughs. So the other thing that you find, the third point, is that both Joshua and Thutmose followed a policy of disarmament. Thutmose talks about all the swords that he confiscated, all the weapons of war. Joshua tells us that he confiscated and burned many of those. So both of them had a policy of disarming. What is fascinating with Joshua is he never confiscated those for Israel's armies and allowed Israel to grow stronger because of the armaments. This policy did not change until, as we will see a couple of classes from now, until Deborah. She is the first one who changes this policy, and it is that at that point in time that Israel begins to have very strong, successful campaigns, and actually begins to have a hold on the land that is never again broken until Nebuchadnezzar. So that will, as we will see, becomes a very crucial campaign in Israel's Judges era as they come into the monarchy. The other thing that you find is that some towns are condemned and deemed unrehabilitable. These towns were usually burned. They were burned with all the possessions, men, women, and children. As a matter of fact, Amenhotep, Thutmose's son, describes this horrific scene where he had taken the city, he had brought them out of the city into this field, and he had put everything on this field. He had dug a moat around them, and I believe he put water or something around it. And then he set everything within that territory on fire, all the population of the city with their possessions, everything. This was deemed because of the grievances of the city were so distraught as far as they were they were unfriendly, they were very hostile, so nothing could be redeemed with that territory because there was a hostility between the two. At least that is what I am assuming here in this from these actions, because there were other cities that did indeed open up to Pharaoh, and when they did, they were granted peace. But what we see with this is that there is a similarity of policy regarding war. So this again shows that Joshua and Thutmose would have been somewhat contemporary, because we really don't find these types of policies earlier in Egyptian history, and we don't find them later in Egyptian history. For Israel, we find that these policies are ongoing until Deborah, and Deborah lives right around 1285 BCE. So it's right around there that we find a change in the disarmament protocol. So this leaves a range from about 1500 all the way down to about 1285 for these policies to be very contemporary. The next thing that we're going to find here, whoops, my thing, okay, is the Hittite treaties. We find that during this period of time, which would have been the 15th century, from say 1500 BCE all the way to 1400 BCE, we find that Hittite treaties all of a sudden take on a very, very formal structure to them. A structure that is very similar to the covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai and again in Moab. And this particular structure, let's see, hold on. I may have this out of, okay, I'm going to go over here and we'll go back. I have this out of order here. The very specific structure are the 9 points listed on this slide. You find that there's a preamble, a historical prologue, there's stipulations on both parties, there's qualifications for storage and deposit, a requirement for periodic public reading. What's fascinating when you read about the Treaty of Kadesh with Ramesses and the Hittite kings, you find that it called for periodic reading, where the covenant and the tablet was supposed to be read in a public square in front of a large population. And that was to make sure that keep the covenant binding and invoked on future generations. It was also to bring an awareness that that covenant was valid, and by the monarchs it was a way for the monarch to acknowledge his fidelity to the covenant, to acknowledge that he was still in compliance by continuing that periodic public reading. When you breach a covenant, you usually don't want it read. You don't want anyone to know about it. You kind of tuck it, in the back corner of your archive so it won't really be found. So this really was a form of accountability on the sides of both parties. You also had a long list of witnesses. These were often gods that were invoked in the treaties. Then you had the oath, and this oath was usually ratified by taking some sort of vow while you slit an animal's throat, and you would take a self-imprecating curse upon you, your family, or your nation. And it would basically be something to the effect that if I and my house do not uphold all the words of this covenant, then may what happens to this animal happen to us if we don't obey it. And that was to show your sincerity, but it was also to hold you accountable, because if you reneged on your oath, then you had the gods as witnesses that would maintain the right, and they would maintain the justice. Of course, for Israel, this oath would have been taken to YHWH and no other gods. Then you also had promises for blessings and penalties for breach of pact. The blessings could have been a grant of protection. It could have been a share in the tribute. It could have been standing armies, providing with garrisons, all sorts of things. We find that one of the things that Ramesses' treaty with Haiti allowed or provided for was it provided for food stores for grain in a time of famine. Egypt was not usually affected by the famines that often plagued the Levant, simply because Egypt was fed from the Nile, and the headwaters at Lake Victoria were much further south. So a lot of times Egypt withstood that and was not affected. So that it was one of the things that the Hittite treaty blessed, or that the Egyptian treaty with the Hittites blessed them with, was the access to food. Now, the 10th one is something that is unique to Israel. It's an act, feature, or sign that demonstrates compliance. This was not common within Hittite treaties. But what we do see, we see a cultural precedent being established by Israel. Israel is given the covenant with God anywhere between 80 and 100 years prior to the Hittite treaties that we see throughout the land. So what's fascinating too is that you read in Judges 1 and 2 that Israel, rather than driving the Canaanites out of the land, they began making treaties to them and offering them vassal status. So in exchange for taxes, in exchange for revenue, they allowed them to stay on the land rather than driving them off. But Israel makes these treaties with them, and then they become very wealthy. So in the course of this treaty-making process that Israel did, it's very possible that that is where we find the Hittites now having a formal covenant structure the same as Israel, because they're actually covenanting and treating with Israel. Let me go back to, if I can get this one, there it goes. The effect of Egyptian and Israelite war policy. And this is very important to note, even though you had the initial conquest campaign under Joshua and the elders, You know, when you read Judges 1 and 2, it says there was very much, a very large section of land yet to be conquered and yet to be inhabited. But what's fascinating with what happened under Othniel and under Tutmosis is that you found that it weakened all of those petty states that existed in the land of Canaan. And it allowed Deborah's future resilience. It allowed her to achieve a precedent that had never seen before, both her and Barak, because of what had been done in the previous era. So I'm just going to read what Donald Redford states. He is an Egyptologist, and this is from his book, Egypt in Ancient Times. I actually had it, if you look before, on my shelf, but it's Egypt, Canaan, and Israel in Ancient Times is the full title. So this is what Donald Redford says. It says, in consequence, the hill country was virtually depopulated and the country severely weakened. Never again would the Asiatics use Palestine as a base from which to attack Egypt. The territory was held as insurance against the hostility of Egypt's neighbors. So what this means is that Egypt used Canaan as a buffer zone to prevent Assyria, Babylon, the Hittites, anyone from coming through that natural land bridge and coming into Egypt and attacking them. So Tutmosis had deported them. His son Amenhotep the second tells us that he had deported almost 200,000 people by the time we get to the end of his reign. So that was a very large portion of the population in Canaan at this time, simply because they were not a very populous people in comparison to other functioning civilizations. Now we're going to skip this slide and go over here. Now, another cultural custom that we find that arises during this area is the wearing of tzitzits. Before Israel comes into Canaan, they are told to make ribbons of blue around the fringes of the borders of their garments throughout their generations. You know, modernly, we have a lot of modern interpretations as to what this is and how it should be worn. But anciently, I think there was a different understanding as to what a tzitzit was and how it should be worn. You find that all of a sudden, right around somewhere 1460, all the way down to about 1320 BCE, you find these Asiatics from Canaan. So they're not identified as Israelites or as Hebrews, but all of a sudden, a whole new cultural fashion just takes place across Canaan. And this is the wearing of red and blue fringes on the hems and the seams of their garments. It really becomes quite iconic when you look at some of these reliefs. What you are looking at here are two different reliefs of Asiatics from Canaan bearing gifts and bringing tribute to Pharaoh. And notice that the trim of their garments are indeed in red and in blue. So it is possible, it is not without the realm of possibilities, that these may actually be Hebrews, early Israelites within the land of Canaan. It is certainly a possibility that we have to leave open in the context of Numbers and Israel's cultural fashion of the day. Something, again, we don't see earlier, and we really don't see it later in time either. The next thing that I really wanted to talk about is this idea of ethnicity as we come into the discussion of who the Apirus were, what their role was within the land of Canaan, and are they Israelites? First of all, let me state that the word Apiru, as I mentioned before, exists in history from about 1800 BCE. So it occurs right around the time of Abraham and the time that Abraham would have been in Ur. So this idea of ethnicity is something that we find is naturally entropic in value, and I'll explain that in a moment. There are three different ways that ethnicity is often identified. First of all would be a place of origin. So this would mean regardless as to whether you or I come from a Hispanic, an an English, a French, a Russian background, Iranian, it doesn't matter our background. If we were born in America, we have a common place of origin. We have a common land and territory from which we originate, and that binds us together. That is what identifies us. The next thing that you find is that often it is a race or a family that identifies you and links you together. We find this even today, like say in the Zulu tribes of Africa, and in some of the Armenian communities. When you get to kind of the old world, there are still enclaves of families that have lived in a particular place for hundreds and some of them even thousands of years. And that race and that family really binds them together and is an identifier. The third one that you find is language. Language is another tool by which people are grouped together and they are bonded together naturally. It's just natural law how it works. You know, you and I live, most of us live in America or we live somewhere in Europe, and we live among people that speak a common language. And this allows us to have relationships, to conduct business because we can understand each other. You find the same thing in the ancient world. And in particular with Israel, as we're going to see in a minute, they started originally from all three. They had all three of these. Originally, Hebrews had a common place of origin around Ur. Originally, they had the same race and family. And originally they had the same language. If you'll remember in Genesis 10 and 11, it talks about how God divided the languages of the earth according to the families. So God didn't give, you know, two brothers within the same family different languages, but he gave different clans within the children of Noah different languages. So you find that originally the Apirus and all people really would have had all three of these in common. But then there is the law of entropy, which states that organized things become disorganized over time, and that's what we have in this case. Place of origin. Ur begins to collapse. The temple states become disproportionately strong and mighty. They begin oppressing their citizens and confiscating land. This causes a huge migration out of Ur as people look for a place to live freely. Families want liberty to raise their children. You find that they were originally a race and a family. Now, some of those do indeed maintain that, and mainly Abraham retains that only because he leaves Ur and he leaves Mesopotamia, and he becomes this anomaly within Canaan, and that really almost serves as a protection for his Apiru or his Hebrew identity. You find that Hebrews exist within Mesopotamia all the way down to around 1200 BCE, where the term falls into disuse. Originally, you find that these Apirus may have had some race or family origin, but as they intermarry, as they come in contact with other nations, they begin to lose it. You find as well, they originally had the same language, but again, as they migrate through the nations, they begin to lose this unity of language, and they begin to adapt to the language of the cultures and the nations that they are living. So as time progresses, Apirus don't always share the same language, although Donald Redford does argue that they do. You might find that some of them also are in league with other and living in other places throughout Mesopotamia. So this is just a background to the ideas of ethnicity and what it meant to be Apiru, not only in the 18th century, but later on as you come into the conquest and kingdom eras for Israel. Now, who is Ivrit? Now, Ivrit is the Hebrew word for the word Hebrew. This is how it is spelled in Hebrew. So, and I'm just going to read this. This is going to be page 549 in Yahweh Exists. It says, Scripture calls Abraham and his descendants Hebrews, Ibri in Hebrew. You can see this in Genesis 14:13 and Exodus 7:16. The term Hebrew is derived from Abraham's ancestor Eber, Shem's fourth generation grandson. Now, Eber really becomes this iconic figure in Israelite history because he lived at the time when the Tower of Babel was destroyed and people and families were dispersed across the face of the earth. So because his family formed one of the major clans by which languages were divided, his name naturally becomes a patronym for the language of his descendants. So the word Eber becomes, Hebrew as Hebrew speakings of that language. Again, originally they would have had family ties that is loosened as time goes on. Continuing, Assyria's royal archives appear to list Eber's name as Habiru, which according to the custom became Hebrew. And yes, we actually do have some of the patriarchs from Israel that do show some contemporaryity with ancient Assyrian archives within the land of Canaan. You actually find some of the people, we're giving very lengthy lifespans for the antediluvians, the people who lived before the flood. Now, Assyria does the same thing. Their numbers are disproportionately larger. I believe it gives hundreds of thousands of years for the duration of time that they lived. But what it does show is a similar history and a similar recording of historical events, even though they may be inflated. Patriarchal names were used to designate children in ancient times. The late great Abraham Malamat of Hebrew University in Jerusalem observed, each son in turn acts as an eponym of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The tribes encompass broad lineages which are divided into maximal, major, and minor and millennial lines. And this is indeed what you find. Abraham would have been a millennial line. Even though Abraham would have been the firstborn descendant and firstborn heir within the Shem clan, you find, and then later within the Eber clan, you find that he is one person. He leaves he leaves Haran to establish his own clan within Canaan. And this minimal line really has a phenomenal history and becomes a maximal in the fact that throughout history, the Abraham clan is the only one that retains any idea of being Hebrew in any sort of way, because the other ones are lost as they integrate and are assimilated among the nations of Mesopotamia, Babylon, and perhaps even into Mitanni and northward. So when we come into the particular period of time where the Hebrews are active in the land of Canaan, it's a good idea for us to have an idea as to what the historical background is to the Hebrew campaigns. At this point in time, we have Amenhotep III, who is ruling over Egypt. We have his son, Amenhotep IV, who's better known as Akhenaten, the heretical pharaoh, who introduces this, what some argue is a monotheistic religion. He becomes obsessed with it, it would seem. He really ignores all of the matters of state in this effort to worship the god Aten. So this is a very controversial figure in Egyptian history. And then finally we come into Tukhtamen, who probably has more literature written on him, and he has had more X-rays, MRIs, and scans than all of us put together. Egypt has really invested a lot in understanding Tukhtamen, the way that he died. I think we've understand that he had several diseases. He was born with birth defects because of all the inbreeding within the Egyptian dynasties. And so we know quite a bit about Tukhtamen. His tomb, and the reason that we have this gorgeous funerary mask is because his tomb was indeed found intact in the 1930s by Howard Carver, one of the very first intact tombs that has ever been found in Egypt, with just a treasure trove of gold and furniture, and really increased our understanding of Egypt. So for Israel, so these are the Egyptian players at the time that the Apiru are making trouble in Canaan. So what about Israel? What's going on in Israel? Well, this is Ehud's administration. And scripture tells us, let me just give you the breakdown of Ehud here. Because Ehud rules over Israel for 80 years. This is an incredible length of time for any one person to live long enough or to rule over Israel. We find that this dates for Israelite chronology from about 1394 all the way down to about 1294. Israel has about 80 to 100 years of prosperity where they're really not accosted by anyone. We do know that Akhenaten talks about making one raid into Canaan and deporting Apiru. I believe it was about 1,800 Apiru that he deported, but significantly lower numbers than what his father had done, because his father had possibly deported upwards of 20,000 Apiru and Shasu, people who could be theoretically termed Israelites or identified as Israelites during this early period of time of Israelite history. So Ehud, remember, he makes the famous act of treason with Ehud and shoves a dagger into this really obese man's stomach. And with this, Israel wars against Canaan. They throw off Moab's oppression, and they have 80 years of prosperity. They don't have to pay tribute. They are autonomous. Now, Israel has finally learned, after being on the land for almost 100 years, or actually a little bit more than 100 years, that in order to live on Canaan, she cannot stay there and live peaceably with the other people of the land because they have competing interests. The Canaanites want Israel's tribute and want to oppress Israel's citizens as much as Israel wants to oppress the Canaanites and get money and extract money from their citizens. So you have these competing powers. So Israel is finally learning that if they're going to be free, if they are going to have a homeland and live there without fear of being oppressed or fear of military action, they actually have to drive the people out of the land, and they have to actually conquer and retain the cities that they had originally gained during the original Exodus campaign. So we find that this leads us into the Amarna tablets. And I just really had fun with this slide because it was a great slide on the internet. I actually just said, well, let's put it in here because this really captures the idea of how important the Amarna tablets were. And this is just a brief history of the Amarna tablets. I'm going to read this for you guys. They were discovered in 1887 by a peasant woman in Egypt. They were actually in a dump. It was like a garbage dump where they were found. And some of them had already been sold. Some of them had been used for just everyday purposes before they came to the attention of scholars. So the Amarna tablets were written in cuneiform, describe the Habiru, which many understand as a distinct reference to the Hebrews as early conquerors of Canaan. This shows that the Apiru were well known in Mesopotamia by the early 2nd millennium BC, which is consistent with the Bible's patriarchal accounts. So this is just a picture of one of those tablets. And again, the idea of who were the Apiru, because we really need to have a firm foundation, because some people will come out and they will say that the Apiru are only Israelites. And this is actually inaccurate. Remember, although Abraham would have been a Hebrew, there would have been many other Hebrews who were descendants of Eber that were not Israelites, and they were not the descendants of Abraham. So you can have people who are Hebrews but not Israelites. You cannot have people who are Israelites and not Hebrews unless they converted or immigrated from another nation and joined Israel simply as an act of citizenship and becoming part of the nation. So just kind of keep those ideas relevant as you consider the terminology and the history. So I'm going to go ahead and read this again. Who were the Apiru? The term Hebrew is found in many ancient texts in different languages. In Akkadian, the standard diplomatic language of Mesopotamia, the term appears in a logogram, it's not phonetic, as SA.GAZ. In other languages, the term Hebrew appears as Apiru or Hebrew. Many ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Mitanni, and Ugaritic texts refer to the Apiru well before Israel became a nation. Not coincidentally, the term died out as the people of Israel became a nation during the monarchy. And this is something, let me just break here real quick. It's absolutely fascinating. You know, you find this progression that Israel, they're termed Hebrews. Then because, you know, when Israel is in Egypt, you know, it's let the Hebrews go. When they come out of Egypt, they begin to be called the children of Israel. Then the term children of Israel or B'nai Israel or people of Israel begins to replace this term Hebrew. And as they become into Canaan and the monarchy is established, they more have a national rather than an ethnic identity. And then they're termed Israelites, or they're termed, you know, men of Judah, eventually becoming Jews, not until very late after the northern kingdom had been deported. And then the same for Israel, they become Sumerians, or they become Ephraimites, to identify with the northern 10 tribes. So you find that this idea of Hebrew is really lost over time, and it is displaced and replaced. The other thing that you find is that the only reference that we have in later history is from Jeremiah, who is quoting from the law about allowing your Hebrew slaves to go free. So even though the text doesn't mention it, the fact that Jeremiah would refer to the text demonstrates that Israel still retained that identity and understood it, even if they did not actively use it. So that's just a tad bit to consider. So just continuing on here on page 550, texts from Elaka in northern Syria and roughly contemporary with the patriarch Jacob mention a treaty between King Semuma and the Hebrew warriors. This event was a significant turning point in national relations. An entire era is dated by the event. Although most scholars dismiss the Apiru as having no direct link to Israel, some allow for the fact that the term may have referred to an ethnic group of people called Hebrews. Now, this could be attest Jacob, it could attest another family clan that was migratory around 1975. What you also find is that there was, I would say, maybe 40 years ago, scholars really held on to this idea that your Apirus was a term for an immigrant. You know, if you were termed Apiru, you were an immigrant, and it was a disparaging term. Well, further studies showed that when you look at the corpus of Mesopotamian text, you find that Apirus yes, they were mercenaries, they were also shepherds, they were kings, they were merchants. You find Apiru in almost every demographic, whether social, political. They're really, yes, they may have been migrants. Yes, there may have been a pejorative associated with the term, but you find that that did not inhibit them from making their own way in life and their own mark on the world, because they are found in all stations of life, and they were not held down simply as far as their social status is concerned, simply because they bore the name Habiru. Now, the Amarna tablets. This dates from, there's various datings for the Amarna tablets. I'm dating them roughly around 1460. I'm sorry, right around 1400 all the way down to about 1340 BCE. Now, the slides that I show on this, on the slide that you have today, they are taken from a website. This is Mr. Rudd's website. He has done some really good research with this. So he had these, and I thought they would be great to use today, because I could quote it, but I don't think it gives the same sense of what the text actually state. So each text, each Amarna tablet, is registered by a particular number. This does not imply that lower numbers of Amarna tablets occur before latter numbers. It's just simply the number that is given to the tablets. Now, you will notice that Mr. Rudd does have some text here as far as linking it to the initial Conquest campaign. I would say that these texts are actually much later, and they occur about 100 years after Joshua and Israel entered the land. This again is the warring faction under Ehud, where Israel is finally beginning to claim the territory that God had given to them. So let's just look at a few of these. Abdirista said to the men of Amaya, "Kill your leader and live in peace like us. They are won over, the entire country joined to the Apiru. I am very, very afraid, since no one will save me from them. I, Rib-Haddah, am like a bird in a trap in Byblos." Now you find that at Rib-Haddah in Byblos is one of the more vocal voices that we find throughout the Amarna tablets. I believe he contacts the Pharaoh of Egypt about 15 different times, asking for troops, asking for support, because these Apirus are making alliances, and then they are conquering entire cities. We find in another Apiru tablet that they are taking Jerusalem. And hold on just a minute here. I'm going to actually get I'm going to look up the particular wording of some of these real quick. And if you guys are following along in the book, I am going to be on pages 558 and 559. You find that when the Apiru conquer a city, like for instance, when they conquer Hatzor, you find that they plunder the city and they set it on fire. They attack a city called Migdal El. And then you find they also attack Megiddo. That's another place that the Hebrews attack. This is another tablet. Let me see if I have this one in the book, EA 286. I don't have 286. I do have 288. Abdi-Hibda is the king of Jerusalem, and he sends many letters like the one you see here in the middle, where the Apiru are warring, and they are conquering and possessing entire cities. You have the land of the king is lost to the Apiru, and now in need of a city, and now indeed a city of the territory of Jerusalem. So what you find throughout these, and let's look at a couple more here. You find that all of these governors, and these would have been governors that would have been established by Thutmose III or their descendants. Some of them may have had, some of the governors may have had a royal lineage, but it was not exercised in the traditional means because they were basically a vassal of Egypt. Egypt had promised them protection. Remember, in the previous era, Canaan had begun forming alliances with Mitanni. Thutmose came through and he fractured that alliance, and he supplanted Mitanni as far as offering protectorship to the city-states there in Canaan. This is another one, EA 144, for Zimredi, mayor of Zidon, to Pharaoh. "The war against me is very severe. All the cities that the king has put in my charge have been joined to the Apiru." So you find this huge defection away from Egypt, away from Mitanni, away from anybody outside the land of Canaan, to join with the insurgency of the Apiru. EA 271, from Milkini, mayor of Gitzor, King, the war against me and Shuardarta, mayor of Hebron, is severe. Save your land from the power of the Apiru. And then EA 290, from Abdi Heba, mayor of Jerusalem, to the king: "A town near Jerusalem has deserted. Without archers, all the king's land will be lost to the Apiru." So what you have over and over again are these pleas and these cries from help from major cities. These would have been major trading posts. These would have been major military positions for Egypt. But to this date, we have not found Pharaoh sending virtually any help to strengthen Egypt's hold within the land of Canaan. He sends 20 archers at one period of time, but if you're up against several hundred, 20 archers are not going to do you that much good. And what you find are these pleas over and over and over again. And both the king of Byblos as well as the king of Jerusalem, they say in their correspondence, why do you not answer me? So Akhenaten is just fallen off the map, basically, with his duties as far as protecting Canaan, as well as his duties of securing Egypt's buffer zone as the Apiru gain power within the land of Canaan. And this, again, is kind of a turning point for Israel's history, because now they have a larger population that they did not have when they came in off of the Exodus and the 40 years of wandering. But now their population has increased, and along with their population, their ability and their desire to war and to conquer Canaan. These are just some of the cities that are mentioned in the Amarna tablets, that are places. I wanted you to see this because it is fascinating that the cities which are pleading to Pharaoh and asking for his protection and his help, all of these are the territories that God had given to Israel. One of the things that we often miss is, if you look at Deuteronomy 1 verse 7, God tells Moses to campaign into Lebanon all the way up to the Euphrates River. So Hamath, Qatar, all of these places would have been places that Israel would have initially campaigned and secured. Now, we know they did not have the population to maintain those places or to hold on to them for a good 150 years. But what this demonstrates is that Israel was very active as Apiru, attacking these cities and conquering them and subjugating them, really for the first time in Israel's history, and now they're inhabiting them. Now, how are they doing this? We find both from Judges 2, 1 and 2, as well as from the correspondence of all of these governors and mayors, governors is a more appropriate term, from across Canaan, Pharaoh's governors, that they're doing this by forming alliances with different cities. So the Apiru are becoming really, really good at pitting one city against another city, and causing one to fall, and using these power plays to their advantage. And this is something that, remember, God did tell them not to do. He said, do not make treaties with them, do not covenant with them. And that is something Israel is doing during the process of this campaign. So as we will see, that did have a negative consequence at a later time because of that policy. So, but Israel does become strong, they do war, and they do conquer so many of the cities that we read about in Scripture. So Israel in Canaan, this is, again, 1578 to 1390. And this is what I've been referring to with Judges 1, verses 17 through 21. This places that Judah inhabited, that her territory and her inheritance was given near Jerusalem and near the territory of the Jebusites. So it's very fascinating when we look at the Amarna tablets in context of Israel's ongoing conquest campaigns, that originally Benjamin could not drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem. But what do we see with the Amarna tablets? We find that Benjamin has become a strong enough entity, a strong enough people, and that the Benjamites are, as Hebrews, are warring in and around Jerusalem to secure their homeland. Again, originally they could not be victorious because the Canaanites had chariots of iron. Well, now Israel is forming alliances and using other chariots of iron from other cities against the inhabitants of another city. So this is a very historical context. Very realistic scenario that we have with both the chronology and the judges' accounts within Scripture. And so why, again, there's a lot of us have a definite disdain, and we take issue with the idea of God telling Israel to war in a land, to drive people out. This is a context that modernly we are not very comfortable with. I think we have to remember what the purpose of God's covenant was. God's covenant was the ability to live securely, the ability to follow a constitution of liberty. But you cannot follow that constitution in another entity's homeland. We can't go into Germany and follow Torah or the United States Constitution. We can't go into the United Kingdom and set up 3, 4, 5 mile swath where we say, okay, we're going to follow the U.S. Constitution on this territory in this land. You're going to be driven out of that land because you compete with the entities and with the powers, the political powers that already exist in that land. We find the same thing with Israel. The only way they could follow the constitution that God had given to them was to secure a homeland. You and I enjoy the liberty and the freedom that we have today within the United States of America because our forefathers were willing to war for this land. Our forefathers were willing to fight for a territory so you and I can have the freedom we enjoy today. The same thing goes for ancient Israel. They warred within the land of Canaan. They drove the people out so that their children and their descendants could have peace on the land. Now, destroying their memorabilia of the people and driving them out was the key for making a break from that previous culture and establishing a new culture, a Hebrew culture in its place, so that Israel wouldn't be lured back to serving other gods, but so that the monotheistic ideals would really take precedent and take hold for Israel's new society and her new nation. So do the Apiru match the biblical description of what we know historically versus what we know biblically? This is very interesting. And to me, this just really speaks volume. It's subtle, but it speaks volume. In Leviticus 26, verse 8, God tells Moses that if they follow the covenant, if they're doing right in his eyes, that they will have just phenomenal victory. This is what God tells Moses. He says, and 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. So this is talking about how just a few people can wreak havoc. Today we're really seeing this modernly. Look at how much destruction this morning. One suicide bomber, one person killed 61 people in Kabul this morning. We had Munich earlier this week where one person killed, 8, 10 different people. So we're seeing this ability with the power of 1 or the power of 5 is just exponential when people plan, when they take measures and they take means to ensure victory. Well, you find the same thing for ancient Israel. During the Apiru era, with this warring in Canaan, you find that they had incredible success. And this again is what Donald Redford says. He says, the Apiru and nomadic dissidents always had the upper hand. To the Canaanite headmen, they were mighty enemies. And as few as 40 were sufficient to capture and destroy cities. You don't find this at any other point of time in Egyptian history. It is absolutely fascinating that we have such a parallelism of biblical and what we know from the historical account. The history really matches up almost identical with what Scripture said would happen, the territories God gave to the Hebrews, as well as the places that they warred and their ability to capture and destroy cities. So that is just very important when you are asking whether or not this is historical or whether it's folklore. Those questions should be answered by evidence, not just by carte blanche text criticism. So let's just recap. We are winding down the class today. These are some of the instances and some of the evidence that we have for Israel and Canaan during the 15th century. You have a war protocol that is very similar. You have literary hyperbole, this stating that they are as the sand of the seashore, or that they are millions upon millions. We also find that Israel's covenant with God at Mount Sinai and Moab all of a sudden becomes the standard for diplomatic correspondence and for legal documents in the 15th and 14th centuries. You find there's a new wave of fashion that just happens to correspond with the Tanakh and the instruction given in Numbers. The other thing that we found, and we studied this about 3 or 4 classes ago, was this idea of the ban on equid burials. Prior to this, Canaan and really the entire world used donkeys as a foundation deposit when they were building a building, or they used them as part of a burial. All of a sudden, for no explanation, this practice falls into disuse. At the same time that God tells Israel that they are not allowed to eat the donkey because it's unclean, but it was also unfit for sacrifices, and God bans that. He says you have to redeem the donkey or the equid, and if you do not, then you must break its neck if you're not willing to do that. And that breaking the donkey's neck would have rendered it unfit as a foundation deposit. So God was really changing this whole use of equids as sacrificial items. You also find that the word Apiru is phonetically the same as Hebrew. We did not get into that as much today. I do cover that in YHWH. But you do find that the term is phonetically the same in Egyptian phonetics as it is in Hebrew. And then you find that the Hebrew attack and drive out native Canaanites to secure a homeland. This is exactly what God told Israel to do. No different. So whether we look at one or whether we look at all the factors together, there is very strong evidence to support Israel in Canaan from 1500 BCE all the way down to 1300. This is quite a bit earlier than what scholars traditionally ascribe, but the evidence is there, whether we look at the chronology, whether we look at the historical evidence. It is all there supporting Israel in Canaan much, much earlier. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, or discussions. Do you guys have any thoughts you would like to add or questions? Was anything unclear? So it is a beautiful day outside. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to spend some time with my family this afternoon. Maybe go bike riding in this very hot and humid weather. All right. Well, if there's no questions, all right. Okay. Questions, comments. I did not cover all of the tablets, and there is a lot of, there's actually a lot of good information that you can find on the internet, and I may post that later today regarding articles regarding the Apiru, things that take you through some more of the historical information. So I'll put that up later today. All right. Well, thank you guys. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy time with your families, and we will see you next week on Friday evening. So you all have a great week. Shabbat Shalom.